What is the meaning of this?
Madam, I have come to your rescue.
History has not been kind to James VI of Scotland and first of England and Ireland. For many people, he has fallen between the cracks of the reigns of his more famous family members, his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, and his son, Charles I, and their contentious and heavily romanticised legacies. James's reign is often characterised by political intrigue, witch hunting, struggles for power, religious tolerance, and the king's own paranoia.
James was an outward-looking cosmopolitan king, and that starts during his reign in Scotland. He's not just focused on England, he's looking across the Channel to Europe, and he brings that interest in the continent to his reign south of the border. England and Scotland engage in diplomacy much more than they had done previously with Europe, and with both Catholic and Protestant Europe. And that sort of worldview that he has is extended into the beginnings of the British Empire.
James's personal motto was Beati Pacifici, blessed are the peacemakers. Instead of conflict, he favoured strategic alliances. His marriage to Anna of Denmark created an alliance with a strong Protestant nation.
One of the big things that people know about James, when they hear King James, they think the King James Bible. It's probably one of the most influential texts in the English language. How did it come about? It came about as a result of him becoming King of England. Throughout his reign in Scotland, he had wanted to be taken seriously as head of the Kirk, the Scottish Church, but a lot of the Presbyterians were not having that and thought, you're part of a separate kingdom, a secular kingdom. In England, the Reformation had been different. In England, he was immediately on becoming king, supreme head of the Church of England, and he revelled in it. He absolutely loved being finally an unacknowledged head of a church. He got to, as I say, lord it over these divines. And one of the suggestions that came from several quarters was something he agreed with, which was we should have a new, up-to-date translation of the Bible. James really understood the power of the written word. I think it's one of the things that isn't all that appreciated about him. He understood it in terms of propaganda, he understood it in terms of learning, he understood it in terms of religion, obviously, with the Bible. When it came to demonology, he had no particular interest until there was a suspected plot against his life, and all of a sudden this passionate interest is ignited. There had been witches, apparently, that had caused the storms that had stopped Anna coming over from Denmark. Just as an assassin could wield a sword against him, or a dagger, or gunpowder in 1605, witchcraft could be wielded as well against him.
James's own experience was that his 3 regents that governed for him when he was younger were assassinated. His mum was executed. His father was murdered. He himself was kidnapped by the Rutherns in 1582. This was a man that had constant physical reminders that you weren't safe.
Forgive the mask, I have enemies everywhere and have to travel incognito. Also, I rather like the drama.
James has huge confidence and conviction of his own authority as monarch. But there is certainly a lack of confidence in his security.
James's reign in Scotland oversaw a frenzy of witch hunts because he was driving them. I mean, he was in the driving seat. He decided in the first major big purge that Scotland saw, which was 1590 to 91, that there had been witches active, they had been causing storms, and they had been trying to kill him. And this is the real nub of it when it comes to James. King James loved a lucky escape from disaster, from danger, from death. Why? Because this proved that God was on his side. God had miraculously chosen to enlighten him, to protect him, to save him. He always wanted these witchcraft trials to be centred on plots against him. We notice in England, for example, there are multiple cases of witchcraft and witchcraft trials and things. He's not interested. In fact, he debunks some of them. How does he debunk them? He says, no, go and read my book, Demonology. This does not meet the requirements of witchcraft that I wrote in my book. He's not driving these purges or anything. Why? Because he feels more secure, he feels more safe, I think, in England than he had in Scotland. In Scotland, he had really seen himself as the victim of witchcraft plots. He thought the witches were using magic, using demonic powers to try and kill him. In England, didn't think that they were trying to kill him.
One of the darkest legacies of James's reign was the treatment of those accused of witchcraft. In 2022, the victims of the many witch hunts that took place under James's rule were given an apology by the First Minister of Scotland.
And so today, on International Women's Day, as First Minister on behalf of the Scottish Government, I am choosing to acknowledge that egregious historic injustice and extend a formal posthumous apology to all those accused, convicted, vilified or executed under the Witchcraft Act 1563.
James and Anna inhabited a really visually and material rich world. In the palaces that they lived in, they were surrounded by tapestries, paintings, portraits, and the King and Queen commissioned lots of jewels, portrait miniatures, which they gifted to favourites and sent abroad as diplomatic gifts. The ultimate artist diplomat was Sir Peter Paul Rubens, commissioned by James and then subsequently Charles I to create the banqueting house ceiling at Whitehall, which featured and commemorated James and his reign. James is celebrated for uniting the kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland, as well as forging important international relationships for trade and business. But he had many critics at home, citing his excessive spending, lavish lifestyle and his relationship with his favourites. We have a copy of a really important book called The Court and Character of King James I by Sir Anthony Weldon. It was published in 1650 after James's death, and it really criticises the king's character, how he looked and how he acted. Unfortunately, it had a real impact on James and his legacy. So today when we see James portrayed in film and on TV, he's played up into the stereotypes. Much of this was focused on court scandal, unfounded rumour, and as embittered feelings that Anthony Weldon had about the king.
Why was James known as the wisest fool? Well, we know why. We know why because it was in the Anthony Weldon book. The idea, if you continue the quote, was that he was wise in small matters but a fool in great ones, according to Weldon. I would say the opposite is true. I think James was actually wise in the big matters. Big matters being universal peace, for example. I mean, he had very forward-thinking views on that. But in small matters, in particular romantic relationships and things, yeah, he could be a bit of a fool.
Monarchs had favourites, that's just how it worked. And favourites had a crucial role to play in the administration of government, essentially. They controlled access to the king, and they also allowed the king to have a dependable lieutenant whose status depended solely on the king's favour to act for them. That narrative of a weak monarch, overly indulgent and overly dependent on his favourites, gets applied to James and is then one of the things that is circulated at the time and subsequently as a way of essentially discrediting him. Now, one of the ways in which you might suggest that a monarch was overly dependent on their favourites was precisely to suggest that they were erotically invested with them or erotically involved with them. And obviously there's plenty of extant evidence of James's extravagant displays of favour, which even at the time get coded essentially as an indication of his sexual interest in him, in them, that he's having sex with his favourites. That story therefore is already in the kinds of rumours and slanders that are being circulated about James, regardless of whether it was true or not. So it's already there right from the start, and it is then implicit, if not sometimes explicit, in the later kind of secret histories that are told about James's reign that pretend to expose the sins of his court to a shocked and astonished world. So Esme Stuart is the first person who kind of gets into that kind of a role and who James treats as a favourite, shows favour too, both in terms of the gifts that he gives him, the titles that he bestows upon him, the land that he gives him, as well as specific bodily gestures of intimacy and fondness and affection. Having done that with Esme Stuart in Scotland, it's a practice that James continues when he comes to take the English throne as well after 1603. He is now governing a court that essentially covers 2 kingdoms. It's a bigger operation, it's a more complex operation. Starts off by elevating one of his Scottish courtiers, Robert Carr, who he eventually makes Earl of Somerset. He elevates him to the position of favourite. That is a good way of ensuring both that his kind of Scottish interests and his English interests are being protected. After Carr falls from favour, then James turns methodically, very carefully, in a planned fashion, to another man who he can elevate in the same fashion, and that's George Villiers, who eventually becomes the Duke of Buckingham. And Villiers is without doubt the most celebrated or notorious of James's favourites, rises to become a man of enormous power, and indeed carries that power over into the reign of James's son Charles, which is to establish some kind of continuity.
When James died in 1625, Charles inherited his father's kingdoms, which had enjoyed 20 years of peace. In uniting the kingdoms and securing the Stuart succession, James had achieved more than Mary ever could have hoped.
James, my only son, I shall be watching you from heaven as your crown one day unites 2 kingdoms. And we shall have peace.